Welcome to our April Science Series. This is a event that I'm so happy that we do. It's a way that we can help connect our guests with the experts that we have here and all of the amazing work that goes on behind the scenes and sometimes out in the gardens. Well, without further ado, I would like to introduce Caroline Kim. Caroline grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, where she frequented the Atlanta Botanical Gardens throughout her childhood and her teenage years. For someone raised in a city, this exposure to plant life and conservation through public gardens was integral to her supporting her passion for plants. Caroline graduated with a degree in horticulture from the University of Georgia, where she studied farm crop research and worked on plant breeding. After internships with the Floral and Nursery Plant Research Unit of the U.S. National Arboretum and the Arboriculture Department of Mount Cuba Center, she found her way to Longwood Gardens. Bit by bit, she made it northward. She feels like the right plant in the right place, as more plants from the south are being brought northwards with the changing climate, allowing her expertise in southern species to shine. I can also speak really personally about her enthusiasm, her passion for plants, how much she knows, and how she has such willingness to address opportunities head on and with full gusto. Caroline is someone whose career will certainly be illustrious, and it's fabulous to see what she contributes to the team. It is a great honor I welcome Caroline Kim.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Jessica. As she mentioned, my name is Caroline Kim. I'm a research specialist here with our conservation, horticulture, and collections team. Today I'm here to share some unique plants that you can see in the gardens today, and also touch on why we choose to work with what we do. There's almost 400,000 plant species and cultivars out there in the world, so why exactly do we choose to work with what we do? I'd also like to expand a little bit on what happens behind the scenes before these plants end up in the gardens. So you saw in our video that we have a recently launched science strategy. This science strategy provides a great framework for orienting our work moving forward with these 4 pillars of conserve, grow, sustain, and inspire. Our team follows an integrated approach using all 4 of these pillars to guide our work to ensure a beautiful tomorrow now and 100 years down the line. So many of the plants that enter our conservation, horticulture, and collections programs enter through plant exploration. Here at Longwood Gardens, we have a long history of plant exploration, and this year is actually our 70th year of plant exploration at Longwood. These expeditions can take the form of wild collection, but also nursery visits to countries with specialized nursery industries, such as Japan. All of these objectives to these 51 different countries and multiple different expeditions have all had unique objectives, but one role that they all play is ensuring biodiversity in our collections and in our landscape. I'm going to talk about this quite a bit today, but diversity, whether that's many different types of plants, many species of plants, or the same plant from different places, or the same plant with different provenance, this diversity really brings resilience into our landscapes, and with our increasingly unpredictable world, this is only going to become more and more important moving on. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at what's involved with plant exploration. So relationship building is a major component when it comes to plant exploration. Sometimes we will have trips out to these host countries where no plants come back with us to the United States or are shipped back to the United States. And the purpose is really building these relationships and learning how we can support each other moving forward, because we do this plant exploration work with the belief of reciprocity and equitable benefit sharing for everyone, including these home countries. An example of which, we don't pursue commercialization for any of our wild collected plant material that ends up back here in the United States. In addition, there's a plethora of certifications and permits that are required to get this plant material into the country, and there are additional certifications you will need if the plant is considered threatened or endangered. And probably the biggest thing on everyone's mind is, how do we prevent potential invasives from being introduced into our landscape and having detrimental effects on our environment here in the United States? So we use an incredible resource before even stepping foot on a plane called the Plants for Planting Manual. This was developed by the United States Department of Agriculture Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, or USDA-APHIS for short. And this is a constantly updated document that is a comprehensive list of all plant species that are prohibited for import into the United States. So if we have a target species that we're interested in collecting and we see it on this list, we will not be collecting that species. So let's say we go out, we collect a species, it's not on our plants for planting list, and we bring it back to the United States. The next biggest thing is time. So more often than not, these plants are brought back to the country in the form of seed, which means they need some time to grow on in a protected, controlled environment in our greenhouses. So typically these plants will spend anywhere from 5 to 10 years in our greenhouse spaces before ever being introduced to the landscape. In that time, we're able to really observe these plants and observe their behavior. So if we're seeing this plant, for example, pop up in other pots around the greenhouse, that signals to us this is an aggressive plant that could likely become invasive for our landscape. So we properly dispose of this plant, and we go one step further by reporting this activity to the Botanic Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants database. So as many new plant species enter the country through the doors of Botanic Gardens, we really play the super important role of being that early warning sign for these types of behaviors and letting other people know about what we're seeing. So I'd like to put some of these aspects of plant exploration into context using an expedition that our team went on in 2016 to the Republic of Georgia, not the state of Georgia. This is a great example of building these successful relationships because we were able to return to the Republic of Georgia to continue our work in 2017 and 2019. So pictured here is Zelkova carpinifolia, or Caucasian Zelkova. So this is a listed species of conservation concern that has an IUCN red listing, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature red listing. This is a scale that goes from extinct to least concern, and we can see here that Caucasian Zelkova falls in vulnerable, within that vulnerable range. So the populations of Caucasian Zelkova have been declining due to habitat loss through logging activity and grazing activity. And so we approached this plant when we went to collect this plant through the lens of ex situ, so outside of the home country, conservation and cultivation. But we also like to look at these plants through the lens of a garden designer. So take a look at this foliage. It's stunning, it has this amazing deep green tone, these gentle, elegant serrations. But obviously what stands out the most is this bark on the right. This beautiful cinnamon-colored underbark that becomes more and more revealed with age as these young trees have smooth gray bark that will flake away as the plant ages. This tree is now planted in our Idea garden along a corridor near our Hillside garden, along with other woody species that resulted from plant exploration trips in the past, including Corylopsis wilmottiae, which was collected in 2016 in China, as well as Pterocarya hufensis, which was collected in 2018 in China. So in addition to Caucasian Zelkova, we also collected Primula vulgaris, or primrose. If you're familiar with primrose, the straight species typically has white to cream or yellow colored flowers. So here we have that incredible new ornamental trait of bringing in this vibrant purple flower. But not only do we bring this ornamental trait with this plant, the range of primrose is quite large, unlike that Caucasian Zelkova we mentioned earlier. It occurs naturally everywhere from Great Britain to Western Asia, even occurring in Northern Africa. So why exactly did we choose to collect from this population, outside of just the purple flowering characteristics? What you can't see is that outside of this photo on the left is all snow-covered mountaintop. So that's telling us that this plant not only has that great cold hardiness, but that it flowers and has that interest early on in the season. This plant is currently planted in our Hillside garden, so if you're starting to feel those winter woes, you're feeling cooped up, you just want to see something pretty, come see our Hillside in March and see this plant for yourself. You may be asking yourself, where do all these plants go? You go to these countries, you bring the seed back, where do they go? Well, I mentioned some of these controlled environments of our greenhouse spaces, but we also have 1.5 acres of outdoor field space that contains both full sun as well as shaded areas. In the picture on the screen, you can see one of our lath house spaces. This is a wooden structure that provides dappled shade. So here, you can see some of our research field spaces. Here's that lath house I mentioned earlier. Not only does it provide that dappled shade, but it also provides great protection for some marginally hardy plants that we're testing for use in our area, as well as specialized garden beds like this gravel bed you're seeing there. We also have a collection of wild collected boxwoods. Boxwoods are incredibly important to us here at Longwood Gardens, as well as this polyhouse that contains over 550 different species of plants. This makes this polyhouse the most diverse area on Longwood Gardens campus per square foot. This polyhouse contains everything from trees and shrubs, bulbs, herbaceous perennials, even carnivorous plants. A lot of the plants that come in through plant exploration land here after those seedling stages and spend the next few years of their lives in this polyhouse where we're able to observe them more closely before they are of size to be planted in the field or used in our conservatories. We also have shared greenhouse spaces that house a lot of our propagation work, but also house our Camellia breeding program selections. So here you can see some really stunning camellias from our breeding program, but we also have some notable varieties as well as species camellias that are a part of our core collection here at Longwood Gardens. This is my favorite selection. So I know this is a pretty big group, but I hope you all will join me on this walking tour of the gardens. So we're gonna orient ourselves real quick. We're here in our conservatory district, and our first stop is gonna be our peony garden. So the peony garden was originally designed as a full sun garden space, heavily featuring, you guessed it, peonies. But as time has gone on, the bald cypress in the area, as well as that eastern white cedar hedge, have really grown in size, and as a result, have transformed this space into more of a shade garden space. And so a lot of these full sun species and cultivars of peonies are no longer fitting for this space. So we need to look outside of these commercially available species and think about some of these woodland species of peonies that are adapted for these shaded conditions. An example of which is Peony japonica, or the Japanese peony. So not only does this plant check that box of being adapted to shade, but this specific one you see in this photo here brings incredible ornamental characteristics. You are not likely to see a peony with variegation like this anywhere else in the country. We were able to obtain this plant material by building relationships with specialized nurseries in Japan, and we were able to bring this material back where it's growing in our research nursery. This plant will be planted in the peony garden this fall. So plants like this allow us to extend that seasonal interest of these plants. Peonies bloom for a few days to a few weeks, so how are we able to create a space that's interesting and inspiring year-round? So by utilizing these interesting foliage types, whether that's variegation or, for example, there's a fern leaf peony that has really fine feathered foliage, unlike any peony you've probably seen. And that was collected on one of those return trips to the Republic of Georgia in 2019. So that's really letting us think about these peonies in a new way and utilize them as foliage plants as well as flowering plants. On the right, you see Epimedium ninja stars. So this is another great example of our conservation, horticulture, and collections team meeting needs in the gardens. So recently, there's been a growing need for dry shade plants as well as plants that are deer resistant. And so Epimedium are an incredible option that checks all of those boxes. So if you need something that's deer resistant at home, great option. So not only do they have the deer resistant aspect, not only can they live in that dry shade, but they provide incredible textural interest. The color of the foliage is fantastic. It also really strengthens our ground cover layer because Epimediums have evergreen foliage year round. Both of these plants that you see on this slide were received in 2016, so that's showing you again that timeline in our conservation and horticulture team. All right, moving on, we're gonna make our way to Pierce's Woods. Pierce's Woods is a 6-acre garden originally designed by W. Gary Smith, and it focuses on utilizing native plants. This is an excellent opportunity for our team to showcase native plants of conservation concern to the public. And I think probably the best example of this is Cypripedium kentuckiense, or the Kentucky lady slipper orchid. Plants like the Kentucky lady slipper orchid are super valuable to our team and Longwood as a whole because it really helps us to further our mission of bringing joy and inspiration to others through the beauty of nature, conservation, and learning. So the one that you see pictured here is located in Pierce's Woods and was started from seed in our lab here at Longwood Gardens. So our conservation horticulture team has done incredible work with advancing propagation protocols for orchid seeds in a tissue culture environment. And because they've done this incredible work, while these plants are not planted in mass right now in Pierce's Woods, rest assured we have hundreds more coming down the pipeline, and not just Cypripedium. We have other native orchid genera such as Tipularia, Spiranthes, and Calopogon that you're likely to see in the next few years in our landscape. Moving on, we have Rhododendron ostrinum, or the Florida azalea. This is the most widely planted native azalea in Pierce's Woods, which may sound a little strange given the name of Florida azalea. However, we found here that Rhododendron ostrinum of Florida azalea is the best performing native azalea for us in this region. Not only that, it's very easy to grow, gives us few problems, and is the earliest flowering native azalea. So again, allowing us to extend that interest. This plant is a listed species of conservation concern that you can currently find on the market for your own home, which is great to see. However, the offerings on the market right now all originate with collections in the Florida Panhandle. So earlier on, I mentioned diversity can take the place of the same plant from different places. So this is a great example of bringing diversity into our landscape with the same plant but from different places. So in 2021, our team set out to Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida to collect Rhododendron ostrinum from different locations to build that diversity in our landscape in Pierce's Woods. I'm really proud to say that 37 of these plants were planted in Pierce's Woods just this past Wednesday. I would like to mention that when it comes to sourcing native plants, it's very important to source them from a reputable dealer and source them responsibly. We here at Longwood Gardens fight very hard against plant poaching, especially of our native plants. And so I would encourage you all to look at the website Where to Buy Native Plants, which is hosted by pa.gov. This provides an incredible list of resources, including lists of nurseries where you can find some of these plants. Next up, we're heading to Forest Walk. So unlike our garden spaces that we've been talking about, Forest Walk is 20 acres of natural landscape that's managed by our land stewardship and ecology team. These 20 acres are an old growth forest, and so our team is able to work in this space, focusing on conservation work and observational studies. So on the left here, you see Euphorbia purpurea, or glade spurge. This is a critically imperiled plant in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. So as increasing amounts of invasives enter our landscape, such as Japanese stiltgrass, they bring with them higher numbers of white-tailed deer, which increases the pressure of the plants already existing in our landscape. Many plants, once they've been chomped on by a deer, sprout out some new shoots. However, glade spurge does not behave in this way. Once it's been chomped on, it says, that's enough, I'm upset, I'm not growing anymore. So this is very detrimental to this plant. So we've been working in collaboration with the Pennsylvania Plant Conservation Alliance, as well as Dr. Carol Luffler from Dickinson College, who developed the resource recovery plan for glade spurge in the state of Pennsylvania. Here at Longwood Gardens, we have this unique opportunity to function as a living laboratory and observe these plants more up close and more regularly than a typical conservation outplanting. Next, we'll look at Galliera spectabilis, which is the showy orchid. This is one of our native orchids that is probably the most common orchid you are likely to encounter in our landscape. However, this has actually proven to be the most difficult native orchid for our team to work with. It doesn't want to behave in tissue culture, it doesn't want to be cultivated, and this plant has strange behaviors that mimic a rare plant despite its commonality in the landscape. It's not setting seed every year, it's not flowering every year. So we want to understand a little bit more about this plant, so we've been doing demographic studies in collaboration with Dr. Alon Alford at Mount Cuba Center to hopefully unpack some of these mysteries so we can work with this plant better moving forward. All right, everyone, we're in for a long walk to the hillside, so grab your waters, let's get going. So our Hillside Gardens is 6 acres that was designed as a place to retreat and reflect. It features our chimes tower, and the canopy of our hillside garden functions as the backdrop to our main fountain garden. Pictured here is Galanthus elwesii, or giant snowdrop. Last year, 16 species and cultivars of Galanthus from our conservation, horticulture, and collections team were planted in our hillside garden. Now let's turn to a plant that's having its moment. She's at her best stage, she's looking great, and that is trilliums. Trilliums are native to North America, and many of the species of trilliums in North America are listed plants of conservation concern. 5 species of trillium, including Trillium sulcatum, or southern red trillium, yes, it can have white flowers too, were planted last year in our Hillside garden, and over the past 5 years, 16 species of trilliums have been planted in our Hillside garden as well as Pierce's Woods. These are very slow-growing plants, typically taking anywhere from 5 to 10 years to flower from seed, so that's really where our team steps in and how we're able to support the gardens by growing these plants on before they're ready for planting in the garden spaces. Now let's take a look at this absolutely beautiful hydrangea. This is Hydrangea serrata, or mountain hydrangea. This is a species of hydrangea native to Japan. So this is an example of bringing that diversity through different plants. Outside of our native oak leaf hydrangea, we have 5 species of Japanese hydrangea that were planted last year in our Hillside garden that came from our conservation, horticulture, and collections team and resulted from plant exploration trips to Japan in 2016. So I mentioned we're trying to expand the diversity beyond just our native oak leaf hydrangea, but please don't get me wrong, we love our native oak leaf hydrangea, and as a matter of fact, the Hillside planted quite a few oak leaf hydrangeas that our team wild collected in the southeast, so they're bringing diversity both in different types of hydrangeas as well as different provenances of those oak leaf hydrangeas. So as I briefly touched on when we first arrived at the Hillside garden, the canopy of the Hillside garden functions as our backdrop for our main fountain garden. This canopy was planted during Pierre Dupont's time on the property, so not only is it aging, but it's experiencing a very different environment than when it was planted. So our team is doing a lot of work involving succession planning for our future canopy to ensure our main fountain garden maintains its same impact over time. But we need to think about the lifespan of trees, 50, 100, 200 or more years, and what might our world look like in that time. So we ask ourselves 2 main questions. How is this going to affect this tree's ability to grow? And what pests and diseases might move northward or increase in number? Here at Longwood Gardens, we've been asking ourselves these questions before planting any tree in our landscapes for the past 13 years. So we just saw how trees can play that supporting role, but they also provide incredible independent interest through the architecture of their branches, as well as stylized plantings such as alleys that you see pictured here. So you can imagine this walkway would have a very different feel, especially in the winter months, if these trees were not there or if they were planted in a different way. So our team is doing a lot of work right now to ensure the same, if not better, guest experience 100 years down the line, by targeting trees from the southeast and starting from seed to keep these trees in the pipeline moving forward when they're needed. We're not the first people at Longwood to have this idea. You can see here there's a letter from Lewis and Valentine Company dated 1929 and addressed to Mr. DuPont. Here they state they will be delivering a southern magnolia for experimental planting. There were no other southern magnolias in our region at this time, and most people probably thought that Pierre was a little crazy or that he was just throwing money away on a tree that would die in one winter. But as you can see from the photo on the right, this tree is still thriving almost 100 years later, and you can see this tree along the steps of Frog Hollow near our Hillside garden. So we continue this type of work today, for example, using live oaks. So pictured here is a veteran tree, meaning it's easily hundreds of years old, from Cumberland Island National Seashore in Georgia. You can see this iconic southern interaction of that Spanish moss or the tillandsia hanging from the branches, and this interaction is very specific to the coast of these southeastern states. So we want to know, what will these trees look like in our region, and how are they going to perform for us? So pictured on the left is a live oak planted here at Longwood Gardens. This is more what you can expect to see right now when planting live oaks in our region. And you might ask yourself, there's a lot of different tree species native to the southeast. Why exactly are we going with live oak? Well, I mentioned before the importance of resiliency and being tough, and live oaks are an extremely tough tree. So they display that incredible heat tolerance being native to the southeast. This is very important as our summers are expected to be about 10 degrees warmer within 60 years. They also show great drought tolerance, and with increasing irregularity of our precipitation and our rainfall, that becomes ever more important because we can't have entire trees failing in our landscape with one dry spell. In addition, certain populations show some salt tolerance, whether that's saline spray or salts in the soil, and we've been noticing increasing amounts of salt in our soil and water here. If you would like to learn more about our work with the live oak, as well as our work addressing climate change at Longwood Gardens, I highly recommend you check out our YouTube channel, where we have 2 science series talks, one named Evaluating Trees for the Future, and another Growing Resilience, Adapting for Climate Change at Longwood Gardens. So I highly recommend you give those 2 a little watch. So now we're returning to our conservatory district with another icon of the South, the camellia. So much like the live oak, camellias are iconic landscape plants in the southern states of the United States. However, they're not native to the United States. Live oaks are. They also have a very long history here at Longwood Gardens, being extremely beloved by both Pierre and Alice DuPont, who were founding members of the International Camellia Society. In 1919, they planted their first camellia in the conservatory, and within 30 years, that number grew to over 500 varieties. So it's safe to say they really liked their camellias. So now, with our warming climate, we're able to see camellias as options for our landscapes as well as our conservatories. I mentioned this briefly before, but we have a camellia breeding program here at Longwood Gardens, and is actually the longest running breeding program out of any of the programs we have here. It began in the 1950s under our first director, Dr. Russell Siebert. He was interested in evaluating cold hardiness, so he planted out his breeding inventory at a field evaluation site. However, the winters of 1976 and the following year of 1977 were extremely cold and got down to temperatures of negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit. This essentially killed all camellias in the landscape from Washington, D.C. northward, except for one camellia at our field evaluation site, which was killed to the snow line but able to re-sprout, showing it had good levels of cold hardiness, and this was our first release and was Camellia Aida. We now continue the work of Dr. Russell Siebert with even more opportunities now that the climate has warmed since the 50s. So here's an image of our 40,000 square foot field evaluation site. Here you can see there's a wide range of cold hardiness. On the right, you can see some camellias that look like they didn't blink with our really severe winter last year, as well as ones on the left that look like they will never blink again. So many of the plants in our field evaluation site today that are hardy likely were not when our breeding program began. And so this is an example of us taking advantage of that changing climate, and this time making it work for us. And so I mentioned earlier that we had these cold winters in the 1976 and 1977. And so this wiped out the entire breeding inventory at this field evaluation site, so we needed to get new material in. Researchers wild collected material, but we were also gifted 2 species of camellias that became used widely in our breeding program in 2000 by a researcher named Gaoji Ying from China. He gifted us Camellia azalea, which is the only known camellia species to repeatedly bloom throughout the year, as well as Camellia chekiangoliosa, which is considered the most cold-hardy camellia species. So I mentioned some wild collection taking place to refresh that breeding inventory. In 1984, researchers at Longwood set out to the island of Sochong off the coast of South Korea in search of cold-hardy Camellia japonica. They collected large amounts of seed, and they brought them back to Kennett Square to grow out and make selections. The 2 selections they ended up making were Longwood Valentine and Longwood Centennial. They made these selections due to their flower power, their form, and their foliage characteristics, and as you can see, these are the original seedlings from 1984, still going strong in our field evaluation site, proving that they very much are cold hardy. So while we move towards more camellias for our landscapes with our warming climate, camellias remain a very prominent conservatory plant for us here at Longwood Gardens. So we're able to build a unique collection indoors as well as outdoors. Here are some of my favorite selections from our breeding program, and in that bottom right, you can see one of our cold hardy selections. So we visited a few of our garden spaces today, but the reach of our conservation, horticulture, and collections team can be felt across the gardens at large, even the visitor parking lot. You can see that 280 taxa, this means species as well as cultivars, it's just a quicker way of saying it, have been planted across the gardens over the last 5 years that came from our team, but the number of individual plants is much higher. And while I can't touch on every plant that's entered the gardens that came from our conservation, horticulture, and collections team, I hope that I've inspired you all to take a closer look on your next walk around the gardens and consider some of the stories these plants might have to tell. I would also like to emphasize that you all here play a vital role in this process. You give a voice to these plants by sharing photos, by telling people about the beautiful thing you saw at Longwood. You are able to bring awareness to the beauty of these rare and often threatened plants. And this is great for our work because our end destination is not just our gardens here at Longwood. We hope to inspire all of you to steward your spaces and ponder on the stories your own plants may have to tell. If you're interested in diving deeper, I've included a few resources on this slide, the top two of which are blog articles on some of the conservation work we do here at Longwood Gardens. On the bottom left is a blog post about our recently launched science strategy. And then I also included a link to that Plants for Planting manual I mentioned earlier. That's that comprehensive list of plants prohibited for import into the United States. Thank you all so much for being here today and letting me share some of these awesome plants that I get to work with every day and that I love so much. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you go out and find some of the plants that I mentioned.
Thank you.